A wealthy businessman hires a homeless woman to carry his child, but upon the baby's birth, he's stunned by the outcome. Before diving into the tale, drop a comment with your city. Let's see where everyone's tuning in from. Enjoy the story, folks. Meet Jack Thompson, a 42-year-old who seemingly had it all: wealth, influence, and prestige. Yet one evening it hit him. Despite his opulent lifestyle, there was one thing his fortune couldn't secure: an heir. He craved a child. But Jack wasn't interested in a conventional family setup. 2 failed marriages had left him disillusioned with love, which he now saw as a mere mirage fraught with complications. A child, however, was different, a legacy, a continuation of his life's work. Determined to avoid emotional entanglements, he sought a straightforward arrangement, a contract devoid of sentiment. With his resources, he was confident he could find someone willing to bear his child without any emotional strings attached. To Jack, this was purely a business transaction, one he intended to control entirely. His next step was to find the right candidate. The following morning, Jack cruised through the city in his sleek sports car, his mind preoccupied with his quest. At a downtown traffic light, his attention was drawn to a young woman sitting on the sidewalk, sketching on a grimy piece of paper. Her disheveled brown hair framed her face, and her striking blue eyes shone through her weary demeanor. While others passed her by, something about her captivated Jack. He tried to dismiss her, but as the light turned green, he glanced back, intrigued by her focus on her art amidst the chaos. Frustrated with his own curiosity, he drove off only to find himself circling back a few blocks later. Compelled by an inexplicable urge, he returned to where she sat, now leaning her sketch against a wall. Pulling up to the curb, he rolled down his window and addressed her bluntly. "Hey, you! Come here!" The woman eyed him warily, her gaze narrowing as she assessed the well-dressed man in the luxury car. She hesitated, but Jack's impatient tone left no room for debate. "I'm not asking. Come on. I don't have all day." Reluctantly, she approached, her thin frame and worn appearance becoming more apparent up close. Yet, there was a resilience in her posture and the way she met his gaze. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Jack studied her for a moment before responding. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere we can talk." She let out a dry laugh. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're thinking." He frowned, clearly annoyed. "Don't be absurd. I don't have time for that. I just want to talk. Now get in the car, or you can keep living on that sidewalk." Her hesitation lingered, but his commanding tone left her little choice. She finally opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. The drive was silent, the tension palpable, but Jack seemed unfazed. He pulled up to a quiet cafe away from the city's hustle and parked. As they sat at a corner table, he asked, "What's your name?" "Emily Carter," she replied, her tone guarded. "But why does it matter?" "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with," Jack said. "Tell me, Emily, why do you sit on the sidewalk, drawing as if nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do?" "I have nowhere to go. I lost everything. But that's none of your business." Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Right. I'll get straight to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that can change your life." Her eyes narrowed. "And what would that be?" "I want you to have a child for me," he stated plainly. Emily blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "You're joking, right?" "No, it's a serious offer," Jack replied. "I'll cover all your expenses, give you full support during the pregnancy, and in the end, you'll get an amount that will ensure you never have to worry about money again." Emily let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms. "This is a joke, right? What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger?" "The kind of man who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time," Jack retorted. "I don't want a relationship, Emily. I don't want emotional drama. Just a child. Simple as that." Emily stared at him, his words echoing in her mind. "I want you to have my child." Despite her initial disbelief, something in Jack's gaze told her he was deadly serious. His cold logic struck a chord, leaving her torn between her pride and the harsh reality of her circumstances. "This is madness," Emily finally said. "No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this." Jack didn't flinch, his demeanor as calculated as ever. "No woman in your position would refuse," he countered bluntly. "I'm offering you a way out, comfort, stability, and a new life in exchange for something you already have, the ability to bear a child." Emily crossed her arms, trying to maintain her resistance, but deep down, she knew he was right. She was in a dire situation, struggling to survive each day. Yet, the idea of trading something so personal for money made her stomach churn. "And then what?" she asked, her voice heavy with skepticism. "What happens after the baby is born?" Jack leaned back slightly, as if he had anticipated the question. "After the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum to start your life over. No strings attached. You'll be free to do whatever you want. No strings attached?" Emily let out a humorless laugh. "And how do I know you won't change your mind and drag me into court later?" Jack studied her carefully before responding. "Emily, I'm a businessman. I don't enter into agreements without ensuring all parties benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract. Neither of us will be able to change the terms afterward. Now let's have a little fun with those who only read the comments. Type milkshake in the comments. Only those who've read this far will understand. Now, back to the story. Emily fell silent, absorbing his words. The promise of security, even if temporary, was tempting. She had nothing now, not even a place to sleep that night. But she also knew she was on the verge of making a life-altering decision. "And what if I say no?" she challenged, leaning slightly forward. Jack gave a faint smile. "Then you go back to the streets. You keep scraping by, facing the cold and the hunger. The choice is yours." His words landed like a blow. She wanted to hate him for being so blunt, but she hated even more the truth in them. He had backed her into a corner, and she knew it, but there was one more thing she needed to ask. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "A man like you, with all your money, why not adopt a child? Or find one of those wealthy women who love showing off their perfect kids?" Jack took a deep breath before answering, his tone more serious than before. "Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. And because adopting or getting involved with someone in my social circle brings complications I'm not willing to deal with. I want control, Emily, nothing more, nothing less." The coldness in his words made her look away, unsettled. She knew he was being honest, which only made her feel more vulnerable. "I need time to think," she said finally, trying to regain some control over the situation. Jack nodded, as if he had expected this response. "You have 24 hours. After that, don't bother contacting me." He stood up and walked toward the door, without another word. Emily watched as he disappeared, feeling as though she was being pulled into a whirlwind she might never escape. As she walked through the streets, Jack's words echoed in her mind. Comfort, stability, a new life. She knew all too well what it meant to have nothing. The icy chill of the night nipped at her skin, a stark reminder that tomorrow would bring the same struggles, scrounging for food, enduring constant fear, and the crushing humiliation of being invisible to the world. She sat on a park bench, gazing up at the overcast sky. Her mother had once told her that opportunities only knock once, and it was up to her to decide whether to seize them or let them slip away. But at what cost, she wondered. Carrying a child, even as part of a deal, was a life-altering decision. Yet, what if this was her only chance to break free from the endless cycle of misery? Meanwhile, Jack sat in his living room, reviewing a contract his lawyers had meticulously prepared. He hated waiting. But he knew Emily didn't have many options. Regardless, he had already calculated the risks. If she declined, he'd simply move on to someone else. Simple as that. The sound of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. His receptionist informed him that Emily had arrived. "Send her up," he replied, his tone neutral. Minutes later, the door opened, and Emily walked in. Her eyes were tired but resolute. "I accept," she said bluntly, before Jack could say a word. He stood, observing her carefully. There was no hesitation in her expression, just a firm decision. "Great. Let's make this official," he said, motioning for her to sit while he picked up the contract from the table. Emily scanned the document, reading the terms carefully. The conditions were clear. She would be cared for throughout the pregnancy with all expenses covered, and in the end, she'd receive a substantial sum to restart her life. In return, she would relinquish all rights to the child. "This seems final," she murmured. "That's exactly what I want," Jack replied. "And I hope it's what you want too." Emily took a deep breath and, after a moment of hesitation, picked up the pen. With a quick motion, she signed her name, sealing the agreement that would change their lives forever. The signing of the contract marked more than just a deal. It signaled the beginning of a new chapter in Emily Carter's life. That same day, she was escorted by Sarah, Jack's assistant, to a sleek black car waiting at the building's entrance. As she gazed out the window, the city, which had once felt oppressive, now seemed to offer something different, a chance at a fresh start. Emily didn't speak much during the ride to Jack's mansion, but Sarah tried to break the silence. "You'll like the place. It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." Her friendly tone contrasted sharply with the cold formality of the contract Emily had just signed. Emily simply nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the past few hours. When the car finally arrived at the mansion, her eyes widened. The grand iron gates swung open, revealing a sprawling property surrounded by immaculately manicured gardens. At its center stood the mansion, an imposing structure of marble and glass that seemed as cold and calculated as the man who owned it. Sarah led her inside, and Emily barely had time to take in the opulent details: crystal chandeliers, sweeping marble staircases, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. This wasn't her world, but for now, it would be her new reality. "I'll show you to your room," Sarah said with a smile. "It's one of the best suites in the house." Emily followed in silence. Upon entering the room, she was greeted by a massive bed with crisp linen sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a bathroom larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Sarah added before leaving her alone. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft fabric of the sheets. It was surreal. Just yesterday, she'd been sleeping on cold sidewalks, and now she was surrounded by luxury. But as comfortable as it was, there was still something heavy in the air. She knew she wasn't a guest, she was part of a business deal. In the days that followed, Emily tried to adjust to her new routine. Meals were served promptly, and a team of doctors was hired to conduct initial exams. As expected, Jack kept his distance. He was focused on work, rarely appearing around the house except to check the reports Sarah gave him on Emily's progress. On one of those rare occasions, they crossed paths in the hallway. Emily was leaving a medical appointment when she saw Jack walking toward her, his posture as impeccable as ever, his expression serious. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone more obligatory than concerned. Emily hesitated before answering. "Everything is as expected, I guess?" He nodded, not delving further into the conversation. However, before walking away, he gave her one last look. "If you need anything, ask Sarah. I want you to be well." She didn't know what to make of that comment. Was it genuine kindness or just a way to ensure the agreement went smoothly? Either way, that brief encounter lingered in her mind. Although she was being treated like royalty, Emily couldn't ignore the growing dilemmas within her. One silent night, she stepped onto the balcony of her room and gazed at the vast garden illuminated by moonlight. Everything was so calm, so far removed from the reality she knew. "Am I doing the right thing?" she thought, hugging herself against the cold wind. The idea of carrying a child and then giving it away felt increasingly complex, and though the contract made it clear she would have no rights to the child, she didn't know how she'd handle it emotionally. Meanwhile, Jack watched everything from a distance. He knew Emily was resilient, but he also recognized that she carried significant emotional weight. Despite his cold demeanor, he felt a faint twinge of curiosity about her. Who was this woman who had accepted such an unusual proposal? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that maybe she was more than just part of a plan? One evening, Emily was in the living room, browsing through a book from the shelf. She wasn't a fan of classic literature, but there was something comforting about the quiet of the house and the scent of old books. Jack walked in, surprising her. He seemed distracted, holding a folder of documents in his hand. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping in the middle of the room. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied with a sarcastic smile. He frowned but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sat in a nearby armchair. "Are you settling in?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I think so," she answered hesitantly. "But it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Jack leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't have to feel strange. This is a contract, Emily. An agreement. I assure you, everything will be carried out exactly as planned." "That's what you do, isn't it?" she said with a hint of defiance. "Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes." He looked at her closely, as if deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing. "That's how I've built everything I have. Planning prevents failure," he finally replied. Emily gave a short laugh, shaking her head. "Sometimes failure is inevitable. You can plan everything, but you can't control how you feel, Jack." Her words hit him like a blow. He leaned back in the chair without replying. Emily noticed his reaction, but didn't push further. She simply picked up the book and headed to her room, leaving Jack alone, deep in thought. The days passed, and Emily Carter began adjusting to life in Jack Thompson's mansion. While the environment was grand and comfortable, she couldn't shake the feeling of not belonging. Every expensive piece of furniture, every decorative object seemed to scream that this wasn't her place. Still, she followed the routine, frequent medical appointments, meals prepared by chefs. Despite the comfort, an emotional emptiness lingered. At night, alone in her room, she thought about what she had left behind. Not that it was much, but it was the only life she had known. Now everything felt out of control. What would it be like to carry a child and then hand it over? She tried to push those thoughts away, but they haunted her, especially in the stillness of the night. While Emily grappled with her internal conflicts, Jack watched her from a distance. He maintained a reserved demeanor but found himself curious. Even amidst his commitments and meetings, he often caught himself thinking about her. It wasn't romantic or emotional, at least not yet, but a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Jack returned home to find Emily in the garden. She was sitting on a bench, her face tilted toward the sky. The scene contrasted sharply with the tough image he had of her. For a moment, he hesitated to approach, but eventually walked over. Enjoying the garden, he asked in his usual direct tone. Emily turned slightly surprised, but quickly replied, "It's nice. Definitely better than the streets." He sat beside her, keeping some distance. There was something disarming about her honesty. "Are you settling in?" he asked. Emily shrugged, her gaze fixed on the flowers in front of her. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." Jack remained silent for a moment before responding. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need, so things go as planned." "As planned," she echoed with a hint of irony. "Do you always live like this, planning every second of your life?" Jack looked at her, surprised by the question. He was used to people who simply agreed with him, who never challenged him. "Planning is what keeps everything running," he said firmly. "Without it, everything falls apart." Emily gave a faint smile, shaking her head. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled him more than he expected. He stood abruptly, ending the conversation. "If you need anything, let Sarah know," he said before heading back inside. A few days later, Jack decided to accompany Emily to one of her medical appointments. He justified his presence by saying he wanted to ensure everything was going well, but deep down he felt a growing responsibility for the situation. Emily showed no surprise, but was inwardly intrigued by his decision. At the doctor's office, the usual examinations were conducted, and for the first time, they heard the baby's heartbeat. Emily felt a wave of unexpected emotion. Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to hide it. Jack, on the other hand, remained still. His expression was hard to read, but something in his gaze had changed. It was as if that simple sound had touched something inside him that he wasn't prepared to face. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said, smiling. "You can start thinking about what you want to do next, like prenatal care and the next steps." Emily nodded, but Jack remained silent. On the way back to the mansion, the silence in the car was heavy. Jack was visibly thoughtful, and Emily couldn't find the right words to fill the space between them. When they arrived, he opened the door for her, a simple gesture that surprised her. "Thank you for today," Emily said as she got out of the car. "It was the least I could do," Jack replied, not looking directly at her. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." Emily watched him as he walked into the mansion, his posture always impeccable, but there was something different about him. Maybe the sound of the heartbeat had touched a part of Jack that he kept hidden, or maybe it was just her imagination. In the following days, Emily began to notice small changes. Jack appeared more frequently in the common areas of the house, and their conversations, though brief, seemed less mechanical. He asked about the details of her appointments, how she was feeling, and even suggested activities to help her relax. One night, while they were dining in silence at the large dining table, Jack broke the habit and asked, "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over?" Emily was surprised by the question. It was the first time he had shown any interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she replied honestly. "I still don't know what my life will be like after this." Jack nodded, seeming to consider her answer. "You'll have the resources to start over, wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." Emily looked at him, intrigued. Behind the calculated coldness, there seemed to be a trace of genuine concern. She didn't know how to interpret it, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in the mansion. One morning, Emily found a package left at the entrance of her room. It was a gift wrapped impeccably with a small handwritten note. "Asterisk to help with your free time." Asterisk inside was a new sketchbook and high-quality pencils. Emily was speechless. She didn't know that Jack knew about her love for drawing. During one of their early conversations, she had casually mentioned how she used to draw to distract herself, but she never expected him to remember, let alone care. That night, while she was in the garden, Jack passed by and stopped for a moment. "Did you like the gift?" he asked casually. "Yes," Emily replied, holding the sketchbook. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Jack shrugged. "It seemed like something that could be good for you." Emily smiled, holding the gift more firmly. "It was," she replied simply. Emily began to realize that the routine in the mansion, despite being well-planned and comfortable, wasn't enough to dispel the internal conflicts surrounding her. Each day brought a new sense of emptiness, as if she were physically present, but disconnected from what was happening around her. While Jack maintained his usual firm demeanor, Emily felt there was something more to the man that he didn't let show. One morning, she was surprised by an unexpected request from Jack. He wanted them to talk after breakfast, something that seemed atypical given the distance he usually maintained. Once they finished, Emily met him in the sitting room, where he waited next to a stack of papers. "I want to discuss some additional details of the contract," he said directly. Emily's heart tightened, imagining he was about to impose new conditions. "More details?" "I thought everything was already settled," she replied, trying to hide her tension. Jack watched her for a moment before continuing. "It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to ensure you understand how things will be after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Emily took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I think I get it. I'll leave, and you'll go on with your life." He gave a small nod. "Yes, but I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the offer. His tone was different, as if he was trying to show a consideration that hadn't been there before. "That's unexpected coming from you," she said, unable to hide her sarcasm. Jack just shrugged. "I don't want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them." Emily chuckled, but there was something about his seriousness that made her reconsider her sarcasm. Maybe he really was trying to be different, even if he didn't quite know how. Later that day, Emily decided to explore the mansion further. The place was immense, with seemingly endless hallways and rooms decorated with artwork that probably cost more than she could imagine. As she wandered, she came across a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and she peeked inside. Jack was sitting at the desk, but he didn't seem to be working. He was holding a framed photograph in his hands, staring at it. Emily couldn't make out the details of the image, but something about his posture caught her attention. It was the first time she'd seen him like this, vulnerable, lost in thought. She knocked softly on the door, and he quickly set the photograph back on the desk. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said hesitantly. Jack looked up, clearly surprised to see her. It's nothing, he replied, returning to his neutral expression. Did you need something? No. I was just exploring the house, Emily said, hesitating. You seemed like you were thinking about something important. Jack stayed silent for a moment before replying. We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves. Sensing he didn't want to continue that topic, she shifted the conversation. This house is huge. Do you live here alone all the time? He nodded, crossing his arms. It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here I have the space I need. Emily studied him for a moment, trying to understand how someone could live surrounded by so much luxury and yet seem so lonely. That must be strange, she said without much thought. Having all this but no one to share it with. Jack looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do. Emily wanted to believe him, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. Before she could respond, Jack stood up. If you need anything, Sarah can help, he said, ending the conversation. That night, Emily went out to the mansion's terrace. The sky was clear, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. Sitting there, she let her mind wander. She thought about the sound of the baby's heartbeat she had heard during the checkup, a sound that had affected her in ways she couldn't explain. As much as she tried to maintain emotional distance, it was becoming harder. When she heard footsteps behind her, Emily turned and saw Jack. He looked tired, but he still carried that same rigid posture. You like this spot, don't you? He asked as he approached. I like the silence, she replied. It helps me think. He stopped beside her, gazing at the city lights for a moment before speaking. Thinking isn't always a good thing. Emily laughed, but without much humor. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. Jack didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. Sometimes being surrounded by people doesn't help much either. Emily glanced at him, noticing a sadness in his words she hadn't heard before. Maybe you need something you can't control, Jack, she said without filtering her thoughts. She didn't regret it. He frowned as if he wanted to respond, but decided against it. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily with her own thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Emily realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't maintain a solid barrier between herself and Jack. He remained enigmatic, but there were moments when small fragments of his true self seemed to slip through. And while she tried to keep her distance, something within her wanted to understand the man who had brought her into this world. At the same time, Jack found himself grappling with emotions he couldn't name. He had entered this agreement expecting simplicity and control, but now he was beginning to see that this was far more complex. Emily wasn't just part of a plan, and that scared him. The following week, it was time for another checkup. Emily woke up early, feeling a mix of anxiety and curiosity. The months were passing faster than she had imagined, and the idea of seeing the babies for the first time, even on a screen, made her heart race. She wondered if Jack would be there for this appointment, as he had been the last time. When she came down for breakfast, she found Sarah going over the schedule with Jack. Ready? Jack asked, looking up from the folder of documents in front of him. Ready enough, Emily replied, trying to sound calmer than she felt. Great, we'll go together. He didn't give any more explanations, but his tone left no room for discussion. Emily headed to the car, feeling the silence between them heavier than usual. Jack, as always, was focused, but there was something different in his demeanor. Maybe he was as nervous as she was, though he would never admit it. At the doctor's office, the physician greeted them with a warm smile. He motioned for Emily to lie down while he prepared the ultrasound equipment. Today we'll get a clearer view of the baby, the doctor explained, adjusting the monitor. Emily looked at the screen, trying to ignore the cold gel the doctor was applying to her abdomen. When the transducer began to glide over her skin, she held her breath, anxious about what was to come. Jack, standing beside her, crossed his arms, keeping his eyes fixed on the monitor. Then the sound came, the strong, steady rhythm of heartbeats, not just one, but two. Well, here's the surprise we couldn't see last time, the doctor said, pointing to the screen. You're expecting twins. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. Twins? She had never considered that possibility. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mix of shock and joy. Instinctively, she placed a hand on her belly, trying to process the news. Jack, for his part, remained silent for a few seconds, his serious expression giving way to something Emily had never seen before, genuine awe. He leaned slightly forward, watching the screen intently. "Two?" he asked, as if needing confirmation. "Two," the doctor replied with a smile. "Both seem healthy and are growing well." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of the heartbeats echoing in the room. For Emily, that moment was magical. No matter how hard she tried to remain emotionally distant, she couldn't help but feel connected to the two lives inside her. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who get here will understand. Now, let's continue with the story. Jack, standing beside her, seemed equally moved. He remained quiet, but his eyes revealed something that words couldn't express. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, touched by the idea of becoming a father to two. On the way back to the mansion, the silence between them was different. It wasn't the usual cold and distant silence, but something laden with meaning. Emily finally broke the silence. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she commented, trying to lighten the tension. Jack sighed, his eyes fixed on the road. "I'm not, but this," he paused, choosing his words, "this is different." Emily glanced at him, intrigued. Jack rarely showed emotions, but now he seemed lost in thought. "Is it scary?" she asked, almost in a whisper. He turned slightly to look at her before answering. "No, it's impressive. Knowing that in a few months, two completely new beings will be here, depending on me." Emily felt a pang of pain in her chest. She knew that, eventually, she would have to let go of those babies, but hearing him talk about them with such care made her realize how connected she already was to them. "They also depend on me, at least for now," she said, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. Jack nodded. "I know, and that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Emily. Not just physically, but in every way. That's important to me." She stayed silent, absorbing his words. It was the first time he had spoken so sincerely about what they were going through together. Later that night, Emily was on the terrace, looking at the horizon when Jack appeared again. He seemed hesitant, something rare in his usually confident demeanor. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he began, sitting next to her. "Two babies, two futures." Emily turned to him, surprised by his openness. "It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?" she asked. "It's more than that," Jack said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these two will become. I can't control who they'll grow into." Emily felt a chill hearing those words. It was rare for Jack to admit that something was beyond his control. She realized that, like her, he was changing, albeit reluctantly. "Sometimes that can be a good thing," she said. "Not knowing what's next can bring things you never imagined." Jack looked at her as though he were considering her words. For the first time, he seemed to be accepting the idea that not everything in life could be planned. In the following days, the news about the twins brought an unexpected lightness to the mansion. Sarah began making adjustments to the nursery that had been prepared, now adapting it for two. Emily watched the transformations with mixed feelings. She knew the agreement required her to give up the babies, but deep down, she realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Emily and Jack started to see that the contract that had united them was turning into something far more complicated. The twins, not even born yet, were already reshaping their lives in ways neither of them had foreseen. The days following the revelation of the twins brought a subtle yet significant shift in Emily and Jack's dynamic. Though he remained the same methodical and reserved man, small gestures began to emerge, revealing a side of him Emily hadn't expected. One afternoon, after a medical appointment, Jack insisted on escorting her to the car, something he would typically leave to Sarah or another staff member. "Are you okay?" he asked, holding the car door open for her. Emily nodded, surprised by the gesture. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." On the drive back to the mansion, their usual silence was broken when Jack asked, "Is there anything you need? Anything that might make you more comfortable?" Emily glanced at him, trying to read his expression. It didn't feel like a superficial concern. There was something more genuine about it, though she wasn't sure how to interpret it yet. "Nothing comes to mind right now, But thank you for asking, she replied cautiously. He nodded and returned his focus to the road, but Emily sensed that something was shifting. Despite her reservations, Jack seemed genuinely concerned about her. Back at the mansion, Emily noticed more signs of change. One day, she found a set of new pillows and blankets in her room, accompanied by a simple note, "To help you rest better." She couldn't help but smile at the gesture. It was a small act, but it carried meaning. Later, as she sipped tea in the living room, Jack entered and quietly sat in the armchair opposite her. He seemed more relaxed than usual, though still maintained his serious demeanor. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. "Yes, I did. It was thoughtful of you," Emily replied, studying him curiously. "Good. I want to make sure you're comfortable." "That's important to me," he said without looking away. Emily frowned slightly. As much as she appreciated the kindness, there was still a barrier of mistrust she couldn't quite overcome. "You're changing, Jack, or at least it seems that way. But I still don't know why," she said directly. He stared at her for a moment, as if deciding what to say. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The words seemed to surprise him as much as they did her. It was rare to see Jack admit any vulnerability, but there he was, revealing a part of himself that always seemed locked away. That night, Emily reflected on the conversation while gazing at the sky from the terrace. Jack wasn't what she had expected. He was still hard to figure out, but there was something human beneath that controlling exterior. She just didn't know if that was a good or bad thing. Jack, meanwhile, was in his office, staring at the contract that defined his arrangement with Emily. For the first time, he felt the weight of that document. He had started this with a clear goal to have an heir and move on with his life. But now, things weren't so simple. He knew he was starting to care, and that terrified him. The next morning, Jack joined Emily for breakfast, something he rarely did. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said directly. Emily looked up, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "I know you still don't trust me, and I can't blame you. I've never been good at trusting people, and that's turned me into someone who maybe isn't easy to deal with." Emily stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've had experiences that taught me not to depend on anyone, to not let anyone get close enough to hurt me. But with you, with what we're building, I realized that maybe I'm wrong." She blinked, surprised by his honesty. It was rare to hear Jack talk about himself this way. "We all have our barriers, Jack," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." He nodded, seeming to consider her words. "Maybe you're right, but changing isn't easy for me." Emily gave a small smile. No one said it would be. Later that day, Jack decided to join her for a walk in the garden. They talked about trivial things at first, but the conversation soon returned to the babies. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, surprising her. "No, not yet. I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own," she replied. "I think it would be fair to do it together," he said, to Emily's amazement. She realized that Jack was trying to be more open, more present, and while she was still cautious, she couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the warm colors of the sky. "I never imagined I'd be here doing something like this," Emily said almost to herself. "Neither did I," Jack responded with a slight smile. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Emily looked at him, noticing that for the first time, Jack seemed to be letting his guard down. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that this wasn't just a contract, but the beginning of something much bigger. The morning started like any other. Emily felt the weight of the months of pregnancy in every movement, but she was determined to keep her routine. Jack, as usual, was in the office, buried in documents. Their interactions, now more frequent, had become a kind of silent comfort for both. But that day, something was different. Just before lunch, Emily felt a sudden pain. It was different from any discomfort she had felt before. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another typical pregnancy ache, but the intensity increased. Alarmed, she called Sarah, who immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. "Jack needs to know about this," Sarah said, helping Emily sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Emily nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain hit her. Sarah went to get Jack, who appeared in the room within minutes. Seeing her, his usually impassive face showed something rare, genuine concern. "Emily, what's happening?" he asked, quickly approaching. "I think it's happening," she said, gasping. "The babies are coming." For a moment, Jack seemed frozen, but he quickly regained control. He grabbed the phone, ordering the driver to get the car ready and instructing Sarah to gather everything they would need for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice firm but with a touch of urgency that Emily had never heard before. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Emily focused on managing the pain, while Jack, sitting next to her, watched her with a mix of anxiety and determination. He held her hand during the trip, a gesture that seemed automatic but was full of meaning. "We're almost there," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Emily didn't respond, but she felt a strange calm from his words. At the hospital, everything happened quickly. A medical team was already on standby, thanks to Jack's meticulous planning, and Emily was taken straight to the delivery room. He stayed by her side the entire time, refusing to leave despite the staff's attempts to get him to wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, holding Emily's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." During the hours that followed, Jack witnessed something he never imagined, Emily's strength as she brought the twins into the world. Each moment seemed endless, but also filled with an intensity he had never experienced. Finally, the first cry filled the room. The sound was both small and powerful, reverberating like a wave of emotion. "A boy," the doctor announced, smiling. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Jack felt his heart race. He couldn't take his eyes off the baby, being carefully placed on a nearby table. Before he could fully process what was happening, a second cry filled the room. A girl. His daughter. Emily, exhausted but with eyes shining, looked at the two babies being gently cleaned and wrapped in blankets. She wanted to hold them, but she knew the moment would be brief. Jack stood frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor's work. Then, as if something inside him had finally given way, he stepped closer to Emily, took her hand, and said, "You were incredible. Thank you." Silent tears streamed down Emily's face, but she couldn't tell if they were from joy, relief, or a heart already beginning to break. Soon after, the babies were handed to her. Emily held them carefully, feeling the warmth and fragility of their small lives. She studied them, taking in every detail, their closed eyes, tiny fingers moving involuntarily. It was an overwhelming love, and she knew it would be impossible to leave them without carrying a part of them forever. Jack stayed by her side, silent but visibly moved. When he finally held the boy in his arms, his hardened expression softened in a way Emily had never seen before. He seemed to connect with something far beyond the idea of an heir. It was life in its purest form, a bond he had never experienced. When he held the girl, Jack closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to imprint the moment into his memory. When he opened them, he looked at Emily, and she saw something she never expected, genuine gratitude. "They're perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Emily nodded, still holding the boy. Tears fell freely now, but she didn't care. That night, while Emily rested in her room, Jack stayed by the baby's side in the hospital observation area. He watched them sleep, feeling a flood of emotions he didn't know how to control. For the first time, he realized these children weren't just part of a plan or a legacy. They were his connection to something greater, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. True love. Sarah arrived carrying coffee. She placed the cup on a nearby table and gently asked, "Mr. Thompson, is everything all right?" Jack looked at her, clearly struggling to find the right words. "For the first time in a long while, I think it is," he replied. Sarah smiled and left, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his children. Meanwhile, Emily woke up in her room, feeling a heavy loneliness. As much as she wanted to be happy, she knew the contract still loomed over everything. The babies, now the center of her existence, wouldn't be hers for much longer. But when she looked at the door and saw Jack walking in with both babies in his arms, something inside her shifted. He looked different, as if that moment had transformed not just his relationship with the babies, but also with her. He approached the bed, handed her the boy, and sat beside her, holding the girl. I don't know how, but this has changed everything, he confessed, looking at the twins. Emily nodded, knowing that no matter how difficult what came next would be, this moment was a miracle she would never forget. Months later, Jack's mansion was steeped in a heavy silence. Emily knew what the day meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been a mix of joy and anguish. She loved them more than she ever thought possible, but the contract was clear. Her time there was coming to an end. Today was the day she was supposed to leave everything behind. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, Emily glanced at the babies' cribs, where they still slept peacefully. Tears threatened to fall, but she refused to cry. She didn't want her last memories to be marked by weakness. She knew what she had signed and tried to convince herself it was the right thing to do. Sarah knocked softly on the door, entering with a worried expression. "Is everything ready?" she asked quietly. Emily nodded, swallowing her emotions. "Yes. Thank you for everything, Sarah." The assistant looked at her, hesitating before speaking. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Thompson." Emily forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. "It's not about what I want. It's about what was agreed upon." Sarah didn't press further. She simply left the room, promising to let Jack know Emily was ready to leave. When she came down the stairs with her suitcase in hand, Emily found Jack waiting in the foyer. He was standing by the front door, his eyes fixed on her. There was no trace of the cold, calculating man she had met at the beginning. The Jack standing there seemed different, vulnerable, as if he was about to lose something important. "Everything's ready," Emily said, breaking the silence. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emily felt a lump in her throat, but remained firm. "That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on." Jack stood still for a moment before reaching into the inside pocket of his coat and pulling out the contract. He held the document between his fingers as if it was something insignificant. "This contract," he began, his voice steadier now, "should never have defined what's happening between us." Before Emily could respond, Jack tore the paper into pieces, letting them fall to the floor. The sound echoed through the foyer like a declaration. "I don't want you to go, Emily. I don't want this to end here." Emily froze, her eyes fixed on the pieces of paper on the floor. Her heart raced, but pain and fear kept her hesitant. "Jack, you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple." He took another step toward her, his expression full of emotion. "I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me, but these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Emily. Not just because of the twins, but because you brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." His words hit her hard, but she shook her head, trying to resist. "And how do I know this is real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can I trust that you won't change your mind, that you won't pull away when things get tough?" Jack took a deep breath, seeming to struggle with his own insecurities. "Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You showed me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this." "Lose you?" Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but there was still a barrier she couldn't overcome. "I fell in love with you, Jack," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. "But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same?" Jack moved closer, now so near that she could feel his breath. "Because you changed everything for me, and I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, Emily, but I'm willing to try every day for the rest of my life if you give me that chance." His words were like a blow to her defenses. Emily felt something inside her about to give way. She knew there were risks, but for the first time, she considered that maybe it was worth facing them. "What if it doesn't work out?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Jack took her hands, looking directly into her eyes. "Then we'll try again and again if necessary. I won't give up on you, Emily. Never." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Emily felt her doubts begin to fade, replaced by something stronger, hope. She looked at Jack, realizing that he was truly willing to let go of his control, his barriers, to be with her. Finally, she nodded, letting the tears fall freely. "Okay, I'll stay." Jack let out a sigh of relief and pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time, Emily felt that this was where she was meant to be. The day was just breaking at Jack's mansion. Emily woke to the soft sounds of the twins in the nursery next door. There was something different about that morning. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty or the tension of living under the terms of a contract. She had chosen to stay. And more importantly, Jack had chosen to open his heart, allowing them to build something together. Emily got up and went to the nursery. She found the two little ones awake, cooing softly as they moved in their cribs. She leaned over each of them, stroking their rosy cheeks and whispering words of affection. Before she could get lost in the moment, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Jack. He stood in the doorway, watching the scene with a slight smile. His eyes, which had always conveyed control and distance, were now softer, filled with something Emily could only describe as love. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the room and approaching the babies. "Good morning," Emily said as Jack picked up the baby boy in his arms. He looked at the baby with a sparkle in his eyes. "I don't think I ever imagined this moment would feel so natural," he confessed, almost to himself. Emily smiled, watching him grow into his role as a father. There was something deeply fulfilling about seeing him so devoted to the twins. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment. Jack, though inexperienced, made an effort to learn how to care for the babies, helping Emily whenever he could. He changed diapers, though he was a bit clumsy at first, gave bottles, and even sang lullabies despite his gravelly voice not being the most melodic. For Emily, this dedication was proof that he was truly changing. One evening, as they sat on the couch with the twins sleeping in their cribs nearby, Jack turned to Emily. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his expression serious but calm. "What is it?" she asked, curious. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I want us to be a real family. Not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side. Forever." Emily was silent, taken aback by the intensity of his words. She knew their feelings for each other had grown, but hearing that confession was something she hadn't expected. "Jack, this is a big step," she replied, trying to process the moment. "Are you sure?" He took her hands, looking deeply into her eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know this won't be easy, and I know I made mistakes in the beginning, but I want to build something with you. Something that's not based on contracts or obligations, but on love." His words were sincere, and Emily knew it. Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "I want that too, Jack. Let's try." A few weeks later, an intimate ceremony was held in the mansion's gardens. Only a few close people were invited, including Sarah and other staff members who had become an important part of their journey. The day was perfect, with the sun shining and a gentle breeze moving through the flowers that decorated the venue. Emily wore a simple yet elegant dress, while Jack looked sharp in a suit. The twins, dressed adorably, were in Sarah's arms, who couldn't hide her tears of joy. When Jack and Emily exchanged vows, they both spoke from the heart. Jack promised to be the man she deserved, someone who would always stand by her no matter what. Emily, in turn, promised to trust him and help him become the best version of himself. At the end of the ceremony, as they stood embracing each other while holding the twins, Sarah remarked, "You make a beautiful family." And it was true. For the first time, Jack, Emily, and the babies were exactly where they were meant to be. After the ceremony, life continued with its challenges, but also with moments of joy. Jack and Emily worked together to create a warm, loving home for the twins. They learned to be parents, facing sleepless nights and constant demands with a mix of exhaustion and happiness. One night, as Emily was putting the babies to bed, Jack appeared at the bedroom door. He walked up to her and, without saying a word, wrapped her in a tight embrace. Emily rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become so familiar. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said softly. "Thank you for showing me I could trust again," she replied. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Jack and Emily were in the garden, watching the twins play on a soft mat in the grass. The baby's laughter filled the air, spreading pure, infectious joy. Emily turned to Jack, who was sitting beside her, and saw him smiling. "Are you happy?" she asked, genuinely curious. He looked at her and then at the twins before answering. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed, Emily, a family, a purpose, love." Emily smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges. Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, the twins began to babble something that sounded like Mama and Jack and Emily laughed, overwhelmed with emotion, and moved closer to the little ones, wrapping them in all the love they had. That moment, simple and unassuming, was proof they had found something real. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was full of love, understanding, and hope. And that was all they needed to move forward. What did you think of Jack's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories. And don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.